Good morning to you all, and thank you very much once again for the opportunity to be here to speak with you and share some reflections on this topic of the aspirations of migrants, and also to learn from you during the day through the discussions. Now, recent media and public representations have had the tendency to homogenize migrants and refugees, particularly through their uses of language, which anonymize people on the move and which speak of them as a singular mass. The more sensationalist strands of journalism and the phrasing used by certain politicians who speak of swarms or floods of migrants and refugees arriving in Europe give the sense of a threatening and amorphous mass rather than a process situated in a historical, geopolitical, and sociocultural context. Such representations overlook the humanity of migrants and the specificity of their personal histories, biographies, and experiences. Understanding the personal, familial, and collective aspirations of migrants can invite empathy and solidarity in a time of distrust, as well as nuance the frames through which we understand migratory movements in the world today. So what I'm arguing here for is a cultural lens and analysis which reveals the complexities of the process beyond an instrumental or calculative understanding of migration to one that captures dimensions such as hopes, longings, life projects, and the imagination. In the field of anthropology, Arjun Appadurai speaks of aspirations as a way to understand how human beings engage their own futures. Some researchers describe that aspirations have the power to move and to motivate, and that the task remains for scholars to conceptualize the cultural forces that drive people to build and rebuild their worlds in the face of often daunting challenges. The aspirations that drive people to migrate within their own countries, for instance from rural to urban areas or across borders, are multiple. They often revolve around the desire, for example, for educational opportunities, to seek health and well-being, as a household strategy for more stable conditions of life, to reunite with family members abroad, or to develop and contribute new skills, or simply to see the world through new cultural encounters and experiences. In other cases, of course, migration is a result of forced displacement, and people move to escape violence, conflict, and insecurity with the hope to find a safe and secure environment. In these situations, I argue, aspirations are no less important or relevant. Scholars of both past and contemporary migration have highlighted how forced migration has forged powerful cultures of resistance and affirmation, and has stimulated new ideas and debates about freedom, justice, and morality, as well as offering opportunities for self-realization and positive social change in home and receiving societies. What connects these different situations of displacement is what philosopher Judith Butler has called the search for a livable life in the midst of difficulty. And she continues that our reciprocal obligations to produce together conditions of a livable life belong to a form of thinking and acting that responds to the urgencies of our time. Some goals may be more immediate and others more distant. Some are perceived as achievable with the capabilities that one holds, others to more expansive and future-oriented imaginaries, goals to be realized one day somewhere in the world. They also change, take shape, and are reshaped through the process of migration, through new cultural encounters, exchanges of ideas, and practices that arise when one crosses borders or moves to a new place. Indeed, globalization, mobility, and the pursuit of life projects in cities and lands distant from one's own is not new either, and we must understand the historical embeddedness of these mobilities, as older kinds of colonial and post-colonial relationships and the global structures they have created are important also to present-day phenomena. To aspire is human, yet the possibilities to realize these beyond one's own locality, or at least the extent to which one can realize them, are profoundly shaped by the passport or citizenship that one holds, the socioeconomic and geopolitical circumstances that one grows up with. It could even be one's name or how one appears, and the regional and global structures that govern and shape migration and displacement. So I'll now turn to a few concrete cases based on some of the fieldwork that I've done. As an anthropologist, the time that I've spent interviewing migrants and following their everyday lives often focus very centrally on this subject of aspirations and what plans people have for their future. The fieldwork that I've done has primarily been based in Asia, and as a way of giving context to what we are experiencing here in Europe, it is important to remember that migration and displacement are taking place globally and in all regions of the world. In Asia in 2015, for example, there were about 75 million international migrants, with significantly higher numbers estimated, especially in India and China, as internal migrants moving within their own countries. UNHCR in 2015 estimated about 7.7 million refugees, internally displaced and stateless persons. My research is focused a lot on migrant workers from the Philippines. Domestic economic crises in the Philippines in the 1970s meant that overseas labor migration became an explicit state policy, as an export economy was a condition of the structural adjustment loans that the country received at the time. There are now some 10 million Filipinos who live and work abroad, and few localities in the Philippines are untouched by this migration phenomenon. The majority are women who migrate in the area of socially reproductive labor, such as domestic and care work, that sustains households. And as populations age, this is a sector, I think, that is going to be increasingly important, where migrants will play a role. And the migrant women that I worked with are often the family and household breadwinners. And almost all of the people that I interviewed during my field research explained their migration decisions as driven fundamentally by aspirations for family well-being, such as improving educational opportunities for the children, or ensuring that elderly family members have good medical treatment, or to save in order to invest in small businesses at home and to have multiple sources of income security for the future. Migrating and leaving the family behind is a very common experience, as mothers go abroad and children are cared for at home in the Philippines by the extended family members. Many of these women also hold higher educational degrees, such as degrees in teaching or in biology, but could only find working opportunities abroad in domestic or care sectors, labor which in many societies is still typically poorly valued and poorly protected. As they work in other Asian cities, many find themselves in exploitative labor situations with few rights and freedoms, as restrictive immigration laws deny them the ability to bring their families and to move freely around the city. They commonly narrate their journeys in terms of a sacrifice to realize longer-term family and community hopes for a stable, secure, and comfortable life, even as they themselves experience quite precarious conditions as migrants abroad. And they send remittances and goods home each month. Even in these highly restrictive situations, migrants build shared aspirations when they meet other migrants as a form of solidarity, and they encounter other ways of seeing the world, engage with new spiritual communities and cultures, or find new freedoms. I quickly shared the story of a young Filipina woman, Zaisa Cruz Bacani, who worked for 10 years as a domestic worker in Hong Kong, living in her employer's house, but who used her weekly day off every Sunday to develop her passion for street photography. Her story has now been picked up by a number of media outlets, such as the BBC and CNN, because she now holds a fellowship in New York University and uses her photography to raise awareness about the abuses that migrant women suffer. Her own story challenges the picture of the victimized migrant domestic worker and highlights that even in difficult and constrained circumstances, migrants have the possibility to develop a voice and to realize their aspirations. Indeed, if more was done through policy to give migrants of different backgrounds the spaces and conditions to do so, there could be a number of positive transformations and contributions. These aspirations that I speak about are not only relevant to the case of international migration, but also internal migration. In China, millions move from the countryside to the city to work in factories. The conditions of labor are poor, and they do not have access to basic urban services, but they still see that moving to the city is necessary for family well-being. In India, about a third of the population is also thought to be migrating internally. They move when livelihoods in the rural areas are insecure and unsustainable, and migration to the city offers the hope for more secure livelihoods simply because of the inequalities between rural and urban areas. But it's also the allure of urban life that plays a role in shaping migrants' longings for something else. In films, in television programs, songs, and novels, the city has been portrayed in the popular imagination as a place full of possibilities, offering new kinds of consumption and new lifestyles. Now even more so with the widespread use of smartphones, digital, and social media. This is why development programs that seek to prevent migration, such as rural development programs in India, which aim to reduce incentives for people to move to the city, or moving further afield, for example, the sensibilization programs that try to prevent people from crossing the Mediterranean in sub-Saharan Africa, may not necessarily work in dissuading people from migrating. Such development programs may give people more choices, but these programs rarely acknowledge the interconnectedness of so many overlapping factors that drive migration, be it economic, cultural, political, and environmental. More resources means more possibilities to make the border crossings that are often expensive and risky. And research has shown that the poorest often do not move, or if they do, they move regionally rather than across longer distances in the first instance. We also have to acknowledge that the power of the elsewhere is firmly embedded in the imaginations of many people across the world. One's locality or region or state is not necessarily the taken for granted location to pursue one's life goals or to find a sense of security or stability. People's desires to know the wider surroundings in which they live inspire them to move through different pathways, even if their options for moving are limited. And this is why understanding the cultures of migration is so central. Robin Cohen explains these as the dispositions that favor migration as a solution to social stasis, unemployment, and relative deprivation. Over decades, these make migration a deeply rooted and almost normal part of everyday life, and young people plan their futures accordingly away from home. Places overseas and localities at home are now increasingly interconnected within the same transnational social space. The intensification of global connections through the media, through communications, and through transport contribute to people orienting themselves for lives abroad. And the global market economy also creates new kinds of desires and consumption possibilities that resonate all around the world, even if, ironically, these are the very forces that perpetuate the structural economic inequalities that shape migratory decisions in the first place. It's also relevant to understand the culturally embedded ways through which people express their aspirations. Ruben Anderson, in his ethnographic study of borders and transit, interviewed potential and return migrants in Senegal, and what's interesting is the way they spoke about the journeys across the Mediterranean in localized cultural idioms, expressing it as an adventure or a rite of passage, and something that young people, especially men, had to try and achieve in spite of, or maybe because of, all the risks involved. And now I return to discussions a little bit closer to home and the debates that we are hearing in Europe, and how we can engage with the aspirations that people arriving each day might bring with them. People are arriving in Europe for a number of different reasons, and their particular experiences of displacement are diverse. These distinctions between the categories we use to make sense of these diverse populations and groups are in fact not so clear-cut. For example, where one draws the line between free migration and forced migration, voluntary or involuntary forms of migration is increasingly blurred. The old migration studies models of push and pull do not capture necessarily the subjective and dynamic life projects of migrants of different backgrounds who have been displaced for a number of reasons. And I reiterate, from economic deprivation and vulnerability, environmental stresses such as drought and desertification, limited prospects for a stable future, as well as more urgent reasons such as disasters and conflict. So rather than evaluating or judging the legitimacy of these varying reasons and motives, it's important to recognize the reality that people are on the move and to value the contributions that migrants can make to the societies to which they move. This means opening up safe and dignified spaces for inclusion and developing initiatives that enable those who have recently arrived, as well as those who are longer settled, the basic conditions for realizing these aspirations. Migrants, however, many times do not have access to these conditions and meet a number of barriers. For example, difficulties in entering the labor market, not having the papers to prove their educational qualifications, inadequate access to quality healthcare, or simply unhealthy living conditions. Or they may face overt and institutionalized prejudice and discrimination on racial and religious grounds, as we've heard in the last paper. And this limits their capacity to act and make life choices for themselves and their families. And this is why basic rights, such as the right to work, access to healthcare, education, and quality housing, as well as opportunities to participate in neighborhood, civic, and community life are crucial to this discussion. Aspirations are relational and contextually embedded. Privileged groups in society have typically had greater opportunities to navigate and pursue their goals, and particular policy attention can be paid to ensuring those groups that are more marginalized or vulnerable have access to similar opportunities. As the geographers Daniel Go and Timothy Bunnell write, aspirations form the cultural terrain over which the powerful and the subaltern battle to shape the city, but are also where new alliances and solidarities among members of these groups are forged. The role of municipal governments, which are dealing concretely with everyday life challenges of arrival and integration, and the participation of volunteers, civil society groups, have an important role to play. And of course, we've seen this to a great extent over the past months, for example, through the Refugees Welcome movements. Cities are where people tend to settle, interact, find social networks, study, work, and where they want to do something productive and positive. But this also involves local authorities being attentive to social and spatial questions and to the inequalities and deprivations that make this difficult. And this is why debates about integration, while looking at the bigger picture scenario, can also usefully adopt a more micro and human-centered cultural perspective. Media engagement can also highlight the shared aspirations that people all over the world hold. As an example, I show you the website of the International Organization for Migration social media campaign, I Am a Migrant, which could effectively highlight how migration and mobility are a part of many people's own personal biographies, while also humanizing the people who cross borders, recognizing their experiences with empathy. In this way, we can try to move away from narratives of us and them, migrant and native. The arts, for example, photography, drawings, theater, and music, as we can see through these days of culture, can be a powerful tool where migrants are active agents in a process of creative production, using arts to express their fears and anxieties, to communicate social concerns, and also to express their hopes in a language that is accessible to all. It also offers opportunities for hybrid cultural expressions that naturally emerge from new cultural encounters. I recently read a photo essay where a project worker involved in an arts project with refugees highlighted that the dreams expressed through art are varied and touching in their normalcy. You might even call them ordinary. And they reveal many commonalities between people of different backgrounds. And we see, for example, in this photo project of the interiors of the Calais jungle camp, some of these themes. Border crossings do not erase aspirations. Rather, aspirations give people a sense of direction and impetus to live through adverse circumstances so that they may once again find hope as they rebuild their lives, pursue new goals, and find ways to carry out an ordinary, everyday life. So I conclude this talk to suggest that while migrants often experience vulnerability and isolation, they are also decision makers and those who have agency to shape their futures. Migration itself is not a problem or a crisis, but rather how it is viewed and addressed. Aspirations can offer something generative and valuable, and enabling diverse social groups, including migrants, to share their skills and experiences and to pursue their human capabilities and their potential on equal terms will enrich the social and cultural life of our societies and shape, in hopeful ways, our collective coexistence. So thank you very much for your attention.